The rain hadn't stopped for 3 whole days, and the sky was a swirling mass of gray, like an ocean turned upside down. The little riverside village was drowning, its narrow dirt lanes now turning into rushing streams of brown water. People stayed indoors, praying, wrapping whatever they could in plastic sheets, and hoping the rising river wouldn't swallow their homes. But Arham, a thin, barefoot boy of 16, had no choice but to step outside. His little sister, Hania, was sick, and their cooking fire had gone out during the night. Without dry firewood, she would shiver herself into a fever. Arham pulled an old sack over his head, grabbed a rope for safety, and trudged into the storm. The wind slapped him with icy raindrops, each one stinging like tiny needles. The river's roar in the distance was louder than it had ever been in his life, a deep, angry sound that rattled the earth beneath his feet. He scanned the water's edge for fallen branches or dry logs that might have floated to the bank. That's when he heard it, faint, almost drowned by the storm, but unmistakable. A cry, a woman's cry. Arham froze, his heart pounding. He turned toward the noise and squinted through the sheets of rain. And then he saw her, a woman in a torn silk dress, clinging desperately to a half-broken tree trunk lodged in the middle of the raging flood. Her long hair was plastered to her face, her hands trembling as she tried to keep her head above water. Without thinking, without asking himself how dangerous it might be, Arham dropped the sack and ran toward the riverbank. His feet sank into the muddy ground, but he didn't slow down. The sight of her eyes, wide with terror, pushed him forward. "Hold on," he shouted over the roaring water. "Don't let go." The woman's lips moved, but her words were stolen by the storm. The current was dragging her away inch by inch, the tree trunk starting to loosen from the bank. Arham knew if he didn't reach her now, she would vanish into the flood. He tied one end of his rope around a thick stump and looped the other end around his waist. Taking a deep breath, he jumped into the water. The cold was like knives stabbing every part of his body at once. The river spun him, slammed him against hidden rocks, and tried to drag him under. But Arham's eyes stayed locked on her, she was his only focus. Every stroke toward her felt like a battle, the current pulling one way while he fought in the other. When he finally reached her, her hands were stiff and numb. She couldn't hold on much longer. He grabbed her wrist tightly, his fingers digging in. "I've got you," he yelled, though his own voice was hoarse from the cold. Her eyes were filled with fear but also something else, disbelief that a boy half her size had come for her. Using the rope, Arham kicked hard against the current, pulling her inch by inch toward the shore. His lungs burned for air, and his arms ached as if they were on fire, but he refused to stop. Twice the current almost tore her from his grasp, and twice he tightened his grip until his nails dug into her skin. The world around him blurred into gray water and splashes. All he could think of was not letting go. Finally, his feet scraped against the muddy bank. Using the last of his strength, he dragged her onto the wet ground. She collapsed beside him, coughing and gasping, her fine silk dress heavy with water. Arham knelt beside her, shivering uncontrollably. "You're safe now," he said, his voice trembling as much from exhaustion as from the cold. She looked at him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Water dripped from her lashes as she whispered, "You saved me." Arham gave a small, shy smile. Anyone would have, but deep down, they both knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would dive into a deadly flood for a stranger. Not everyone would risk their life without hesitation. But Arham had, not for reward, not for recognition, simply because it was the right thing to do. The rain kept falling, but in that moment, on that muddy riverbank, a quiet understanding passed between them. Two lives had just collided by chance, yet neither of them knew how much that single moment would change everything. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time they found shelter under a small thatched roof near the edge of the village. The ground was still soaked, and muddy water trickled in little streams all around them. Arham, dripping wet and shivering, tore a piece of cloth from his worn shirt and handed it to the woman so she could dry her face. She accepted it with trembling hands. Even in her exhausted state, there was something striking about her, the way her eyes held a quiet strength, the delicate jewelry around her wrists and neck, the elegance in the way she sat despite being soaked and muddy. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Arham," he replied, avoiding her gaze. "And you?" "Zara," she said, her voice carrying a strange mix of gentleness and authority. "You saved my life, Arham. I don't even know how to thank you." Arham gave a small shrug. "You don't need to. Anyone would have done the same." She studied him for a moment, noticing the way his bare feet were caked in mud, how the rope still hung loosely from his waist, and how the thinness of his arms hinted at a life of hunger and hard work. "Do you live nearby?" she asked. He nodded. "Just a few minutes away. I stay with my little sister, Hania. She's all I have left since our parents passed away." Zara's eyes softened. "I'm sorry." Arham waved it off as if it were nothing, though his voice betrayed the weight he carried. "It's all right. We manage. I work in the field sometimes, carry loads for shopkeepers, fix fishing nets, anything that pays a little. We get by." For a while, the only sound was the gentle patter of rain on the thatched roof. Zara glanced down at her soaked silk dress, once a deep emerald green, now dulled by mud and water. She thought of the luxury car waiting for her once the flood cleared, the mansion she called home, the wealth that insulated her from struggles like Arham's. And then she looked at the boy beside her, a stranger who had risked his life for her without hesitation. "Why did you jump in?" she finally asked. "The river was dangerous. You could have died." Arham's expression was calm, almost matter of fact. "If I had waited even a few seconds more, you'd have been gone. I couldn't just stand there." The simplicity in his words shook her more than she expected. There was no drama, no self-praise, no thought of what he might gain, only the pure instinct to help. She reached for her wrist and slid off a gold bracelet. It was delicate, with intricate carvings in a small emerald stone. Holding it out to him, she said, "Please take this. It's the least I can give you right now." Arham stared at it, then shook his head firmly. "I didn't save you for a reward. You needed help, and I could help. That's all." Zara smiled faintly, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Keep it anyway, if not for the value, then as a reminder. Maybe one day, this will bring us together again." He hesitated, but the sincerity in her voice made him reach out slowly and accept it. He tucked the bracelet carefully into the pocket of his worn trousers. A sudden horn echoed through the damp air. Down the road, a black SUV had arrived, its headlights cutting through the mist. A man in a suit stepped out, rushing toward them with an umbrella. "Ma'am, we've been looking everywhere for you," the man said urgently. Zara stood, still looking at Arham. "I have to go," she said softly. Arham simply nodded. "Take care of yourself." She stepped into the car but didn't close the door immediately. Her gaze lingered on him for one last moment, the boy who had appeared out of nowhere, who had pulled her from death without asking for anything in return. The car door shut, and the vehicle rolled away, its tires splashing through puddles. Arham stood there until it disappeared from sight, the rain washing over him once again. He turned toward home, the bracelet's weight in his pocket a strange reminder of a moment he would never forget, and yet, in his heart, he was certain their paths were meant to cross again. They sat under a thatched shelter as the rain poured. The woman, whose name was Zara, asked about his life. He told her about losing his parents, living with his younger sister, and working odd jobs to survive. "You didn't hesitate to save me," she said softly. Arham shrugged. "If I had waited, you would have been gone. And I can't live knowing I could have helped but didn't." Before leaving, Zara pressed something into his hand, a gold bracelet. Arham shook his head. "I didn't save you for this." She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Keep it, maybe one day it will bring us together again." She left in a black car once the flood eased, disappearing into the city. Arham went back to his life, thinking he'd never see her again. Months after the flood, life in the village slowly returned to normal. Arham often wondered about Zara, though he never expected to see her again. The gold bracelet remained safely hidden in a small wooden box under his bed, not as a sign of wealth, but as a reminder of that day when fate had brought two very different worlds together. One warm afternoon, the sound of engines echoed through the narrow village lanes. People stepped outside, shielding their eyes from the sun, as a convoy of black luxury cars stopped at the village square. From the back seat of the first car, Zara stepped out, dressed in simple white, her presence calm yet commanding. She walked straight to Arham's hut. He stood at the doorway, stunned, as she smiled and said, "I told you this bracelet would bring us together again." Zara then revealed why she had come. She had purchased land in the village to build a school and a small clinic, and she had arranged a new home for Arham and his sister. More than that, she handed him a sealed envelope containing a scholarship to study in the city, saying, "You saved my life when you had nothing. Now, let me help you live the life you deserve." Arham's throat tightened. For a moment, words failed him. He had never imagined his act of kindness would ripple back to him in such a way. With tears in his eyes, he said, "I didn't save you for this." Zara smiled, her own eyes glistening. "I know, and that's why you deserve it." The villagers gathered around, cheering as Arham realized that the flood had not only tested his courage, it had brought him a future he never dared to dream of. And in that moment, he understood a truth he would carry for the rest of his life. Sometimes, the smallest acts of selflessness can open the door to the greatest blessings.